Shalom, it's Izzy here with Holy Language Institute at holylanguage.com. I just finished filming our 22nd lesson in our series looking at the Mishnah. We call those Mishnah snapshots. Specifically, the Mishnah was the Jewish law written down in the late 100s, and it's some of the earliest peaks we have of the Jewish world, all the way back to the world of Jesus and his disciples, who of course wrote the New Testament. So one of the things I love pointing out is examples in the Mishnah that parallel the New Testament or that help us to understand the New Testament better. This is an example for you. This is interesting. This tractate of the Mishnah is called Challah. Maybe you're familiar with, as it's sometimes referred to in English, challah bread. And there's a whole tractate in the Mishnah dedicated to questions about challah, because there's actually a commandment in the Torah about challah. Not sure if you knew that. You'll have to watch the whole lesson if you want to get this whole discussion about challah and whatnot. But what I wanted to show you specifically is an instance in the Mishnah that helps us to understand better the name of one of Yeshua's disciples, a name that went down in infamy, the name Judas Iscariot. Have you ever wondered what Iscariot actually means? I mean, if you're a kid and you hear that name, maybe you think it sounds like scary. Scary Judas. He was the bad guy in the story. Judas Iscariot. Or maybe you think it sounds like, maybe you thought it sounded like chariot. You can imagine maybe he was the guy who rode in the chariot. I don't know. Like when you're a kid, you hear words and you make these mental connections that can sometimes be really fun and entertaining. And you know what? Maybe you've done that with Iscariot. Why would you do that? Because it doesn't make any sense in English. And it actually doesn't make any sense in Greek either, which is generally where we get our English translations of the New Testament from. Does it make any sense in any language? Yeah, it does actually. It makes sense in Hebrew. Why? Well, it makes sense. Like Yeshua and his disciples, they spoke Hebrew and Aramaic. These were living languages in the Second Temple era. And so maybe you're curious, what does the name Judas Iscariot actually mean in Hebrew? I'm going to show you a little example of something in the Mishnah that explains this for us. So like I said, this is in Challah, chapter 4, verse 10, or it's referred to as a Mishnah 10. It mentions Nitai, this is a guy's name, Nitai of Tekoa. So he brought priest's shares of the dough from Beital. Maybe you've heard of Beitar. It's a famous place. It went down in infamy in the war between the Jewish people and Rome almost 2,000 years ago. Anyway, so this guy, he brought priest's shares of the dough, which actually in Hebrew that word is chalot. You can see it right there. He brought chalot from Beital. And what I want to show you specifically is this guy's name, because there's a word in how his name is mentioned here that isn't actually translated. Nitai, there's his name. Ish, there's the word that's not actually translated. What does Ish mean? Man. Nitai Ish, so he was a man, Tekoa, from the town of Tekoa. So, in English we would just say Nitai of Tekoa. But in Hebrew you say Nitai, it's kind of roughly equivalent to the man from Tekoa, or you could say the Tekoa man, or the Tekoa guy. Tekoa guy. That's kind of the idea, right? So you need to understand this about Hebrew names. Either somebody will be referred to as so and so, Ben so and so, like so and so, the son of so and so, or sometimes the Aramaic will be used, Bar so and so, Bar so and so. What would be an example of that? Remember, Yeshua said, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar Jonah." So Simon, the son of Jonah. That would be an example of that. Or they'll be referred to with this little expression. In this case, Nitai was the Tekoa guy. He was the Ish from Tekoa. All right, so with that understanding, I want to look with you at a listing of Yeshua's inner circle of disciples. In Matthew chapter 10, as we see here, the last guy mentioned is Judas Iscariot. Now, I mentioned Iscariot doesn't mean anything in English, it doesn't mean anything in Greek, but it does mean something in Hebrew. Can you guess what it means? Probably. Here's a translation of the Gospel of Matthew into Hebrew, and here's how it's rendered. So Ve and Yehuda. Now this is notable in and of itself. Yehuda is a Hebrew name. Yehuda was one of the 12 sons of Jacob. Eventually, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, that descended from him, was named after him, the tribe of Judah. And there were lots of guys in Yeshua's time with this popular Hebrew name, Yehuda. This was also the name of one of the heroes of the Hanukkah story, one of the Maccabee brothers. And so, it became a very popular name. And interestingly enough, though, this name is rendered in 3 different ways in most Christian New Testament translations. So the original Hebrew is Yehuda, and then in English it ends up either being Judah or Jude, or in this case Judas. But it's all the same name. So it's one of those instances of how sometimes, thanks to tradition, you get some slightly inconsistent name renderings. Anyway, so we have Yehuda, Judas, Ish, Kriot. So there's our word for man, Ish, and then here's the town he was from, Kriot, Ish Kriot. So he's the guy from Kriot. He was the Kriot man. That's what Iscariot means. So it doesn't mean he rode around in a chariot. It doesn't mean he was a scary guy. Although who knows, maybe he was a little bit scary. And that's what his name means. Now there's actually something interesting here. There might be a little bit of a backstory here, and I'm going to speculate with you for a minute and then wrap up this little preview of our lesson. As you know, Yeshua was, even though he was born in Bethlehem, he was born in Bethlehem, which is just south of Jerusalem, in the region of Judea. Yeshua, and then he spent a little bit of time in Egypt, when he was just a little baby. He grew up in the town of Nazareth, in Nazareth, which is in northern Israel in the province of Galilee. In Hebrew, that's called the Galilean. All right. So Yeshua was from the Galilean, and so were the majority of his disciples. Really, it was his movement was a Galilean-based movement. And you'll see a couple of references to this throughout the recorded history of the early Yeshua movement. For example, early in the book of the Acts of the Apostles in the Maaseh HaShlichim, remember on Shavuot, on the day of Pentecost, and Yeshua's disciples were speaking all these different languages, and people were like, how can they be doing this? Like, these people are from Galilee, like they're Galileans, right? So Yeshua's disciples generally as a community, it was just understood these are a bunch of people from Galilee. Except for, this is an exception, Judas Iscariot. We know that he's from the town of Kriot. Where's Kriot? Well, it's actually mentioned in the Tanakh. It's mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. Kriot generally is understood to be a town about 10 miles south of Hebron. So he grew up just, a couple miles, 10 or whatever miles south of the Jerusalem area. That's where Judas is from. So Judas could have been a bit of an outsider to the inside circle of Yeshua's disciples. He might have been the only Judean in the midst of a bunch of Galileans, and there were some differences even in terms of how they spoke Hebrew and Aramaic. Remember Peter. They could, when he was in the process of denying the master, they could tell that he was from Galilee because of his dialect. He had a Galilean dialect. So obviously, Judas was a little bit different. He was a bit of an outsider, and who knows, maybe he was treated that way. Maybe he saw himself that way. Maybe that actually contributed to the way he acted like an outsider, and he ended up betraying the master. We can't say for sure, but there could be a lesson there for each of us and for all of us, as individuals and as a community, regardless of a person's background, their ethnic background, if they have an accent, their linguistic accent, regardless of the differences. Let's make a point to treat each other like insiders and include each other as a community of Yeshua's disciples, regardless of whether you're from Judea or from Galilee, regardless of your background, because we're all following Yeshua together, and that's our focus. So anyways, that's a little snapshot for you from the Mishnah that helps us to understand the world of Yeshua and his disciples better, that helps us to understand the New Testament and specifically this infamous name in the New Testament better. This is like a little sneak look at our entire lesson. I do invite you to learn with us at holylanguage.com. You'll find our Mishnah Snapshots series there, and you can watch the whole lesson, and I would love to have you join us. All right, thanks for joining me in this little preview about Judas Iscariot.